His hand lingered on my wrist, and I didn't pull away. I should have, but instead, I stood there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The door clicked shut behind me. The air in the room thickened, charged with something unspoken. Ryden was too close for this to be nothing. His eyes roamed over me, slow, deliberate, stopping in places that made my stomach tighten. There's only one way to test us, Avery. His voice was too calm, too controlled, like he had rehearsed these words before saying them. My pulse pounded in my ears, my fingers twitched at my sides. I wanted to step back, to say something that would shatter the strange, electric tension between us. But I didn't move. Test what? My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Ryden tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. I think you already know. A wave of heat rushed through me, followed by an immediate, crashing cold. Everything in me screamed that this wasn't right, that I needed to turn around, walk out, pretend this moment never happened. But the part of me that terrified me the most, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, was the part that kept me standing there. I should have pulled my wrist away, but I didn't. His fingers were warm, firm, steady. I don't know what you're talking about. I forced the words out, but they felt weak, hollow. Ryden's thumb brushed against the inside of my wrist, the smallest movement, but it sent a tremor through me. Are you sure? His voice was quieter now, lower. Something in his eyes was testing me, waiting for something. What? I wasn't sure. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, suffocating, intoxicating. I needed to leave. Now. But I couldn't. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move, to breathe, to think. I needed to remind myself who he was, who I was. This was wrong. This was insane. Ryden, I started, my voice barely above a whisper. His grip tightened, not forceful, not demanding, just enough to keep me there. His eyes darkened slightly, like he knew what I was going to say, like he was already challenging it. Avery, he murmured, and the way he said my name made my skin prickle. I exhaled shakily, my free hand clenching into a fist. This isn't. His smirk deepened. Isn't what? I forced myself to look away, to break whatever spell this was. My pulse was erratic, and I felt lightheaded, dizzy, like the air in the room was running out. This isn't normal, I finally managed. Ryden let out a quiet chuckle. It wasn't mocking, but there was something else beneath it, something knowing. Normal, he repeated, as if testing the word. He took a step closer, and I finally found the strength to yank my wrist away. I took a shaky step back, my heart hammering. I should go. He watched me for a moment, and for a second, I thought he might stop me. But then he nodded, stepping back just enough to let me reach the door. I turned, my fingers fumbling with the handle. Avery. I hesitated, my breath catching. His voice was softer now, but no less intense. You're thinking about it. I squeezed my eyes shut for half a second, willing myself to push forward. Without another word, I twisted the handle and stepped out, shutting the door behind me. I didn't stop walking until I was back in my room, my back pressed against the door, my chest rising and falling with sharp, uneven breaths. I shouldn't have stayed in that room for as long as I did. I shouldn't have let him touch me. I shouldn't have let him speak to me like that. But the worst part? He was right. I was thinking about it, and I hated myself for it. If you think the story started in that room when he closed the door, you're wrong. It started much earlier, long before his gaze lingered too long. Long before his words carried a weight I didn't want to acknowledge. It started that summer when my mother told me we were moving. Avery, you're going to love him. He's a wonderful man. Wonderful. That word echoed in my mind as we pulled up to his massive house on the outskirts of town. My old life felt like it had been erased overnight. New home, new school, new rules. But the biggest change wasn't the place. It was him. At first glance, everything was perfect. My mother was glowing with happiness. And Ryden played the role of the perfect fiancé effortlessly, attentive, polite, always making sure to open doors and pull out chairs. The kind of man who made people feel at ease. But sometimes, when my mother wasn't looking, I felt something else. I caught him watching me. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way that I could call out. But it was there. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was just on edge, struggling to adjust to so many changes at once. But the longer I lived in that house, the harder it became to ignore. The way his gaze would settle on me just a fraction too long. The way his voice softened slightly when he said my name. The way his hand would brush against mine in the kitchen, a touch so brief it could be mistaken for nothing. But it wasn't nothing. And I knew it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was making something out of nothing. But that was before the night my mother left on a business trip. Before it was just the two of us in that house. Before I had no one else to blame for the way my heart raced when he looked at me like that. The silence in the house felt heavier without her. It wasn't that Ryden did anything, at least, not yet. It was the way he carried himself, the way he seemed more relaxed without her presence. That night, I stayed in my room, trying to drown out my thoughts with homework, but I wasn't absorbing any of it. My mind kept drifting to the fact that we were alone, that I had nowhere to escape to but these walls. When a knock came at my door, my breath caught. Avery? Ryden's voice was calm, casual, as if there was nothing unusual about this. I hesitated, staring at the door. Yeah? The door creaked open slightly, and he leaned against the frame, watching me. You've been up here all night. I nodded, flipping my notebook shut. Studying. He tilted his head slightly. You should take a break. I should have said no. I should have stayed in my room. But I didn't. Instead, I followed him downstairs. The kitchen was dimly lit, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound as he moved to the counter. He poured himself a drink, then another. He slid one across the counter toward me. I stared at it, my fingers tightening on the edge of the table. I don't. Relax, he said smoothly. One sip won't kill you. I took the glass. I didn't know why. Maybe because I wanted to prove something. Maybe because I wanted to see how far he would push. Maybe because part of me wanted him to. The air between us was different now. Thicker. More charged. I kept my eyes on the drink in my hand, fingers tracing the rim of the glass. I could feel him watching me. You've been quiet since you moved in, he said after a moment. I shrugged. It's a lot to adjust to. You miss your old life? I hesitated. I miss knowing what to expect. Ryden smirked. Routine's comforting. Yeah. He took a sip of his drink, watching me over the rim of his glass. And what if something unexpected happens? I looked up at him, pulse quickening. Like what? His gaze held mine. Like something that makes you question everything. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I should have changed the subject. I should have finished my drink and walked away. But I didn't. His fingers brushed against mine as he reached for his glass. It was subtle, deliberate. I swallowed hard. I don't know. Ryden tilted his head, studying me. Then, he set his glass down and reached out, his hand closing around my wrist. I froze. I should have pulled away. I should have left, but I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him. And that's when he said it. There's only one way to test us. The words sent a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched, my mind racing with what he meant, with what he was implying. I knew I had to stop this. I knew I had to step back. But my body wasn't moving. My heart was pounding too hard, my thoughts too tangled. What do you mean? I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. Ryden's grip on my wrist wasn't forceful, but it was firm enough that I felt trapped between the weight of his words and the heat of his touch. I think you already know, he said, voice low, almost teasing. I supped in a sharp breath, my pulse erratic. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. And yet, the way my skin burned beneath his fingers told me otherwise. I forced myself to speak. This isn't what? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog settling over me. This isn't normal. Ryden let out a quiet chuckle, tilting his head. Normal sporing. My stomach twisted. I willed myself to move, to step back, to put space between us. But I didn't. Because despite everything, despite every red flag screaming at me to run, I couldn't deny the way my body reacted to him. To the way he looked at me. To the way he said my name. This wasn't right. I knew that. And yet, I didn't pull away. His eyes darkened slightly, his grip tightening just a fraction. You're thinking about it. My breath came out shaky. Thinking about what? Ryden smirked, as if he could hear everything I wasn't saying. I clenched my jaw. I should go. He didn't stop me. He didn't block my way. He simply let go of my wrist and leaned back, giving me just enough space to step away. But as I turned toward the hallway, my legs felt unsteady. My mind was racing. I didn't stop moving until I was in my room, the door shut behind me, my back pressed against the wood. My hands were trembling. I shouldn't have stayed in that kitchen for as long as I did. I shouldn't have let him touch me. I shouldn't have let him speak to me like that. It started with small things. A glance that lasted a second too long. A touch that should have meant nothing but left something dangerous in its wake. A moment in a narrow hallway, where space was suddenly too tight and the air too heavy. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into the way his eyes lingered, the way his fingertips brushed against mine when passing a plate at dinner, the way his voice dropped ever so slightly when he said my name. It had to be in my head, because the alternative, the possibility that something was really happening, was something I wasn't ready to face. But I wasn't controlling anything. I was playing with fire, and I was about to get burned. One evening, when my mother was working late, Ryden and I were left alone. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the fridge and the occasional clink of ice against glass as he sat at the kitchen counter, swirling whiskey in his hand. I hesitated in the doorway, telling myself to turn around, to go back upstairs, to pretend I hadn't seen him sitting there. But I didn't. Instead, I walked in, my heart hammering for reasons I didn't want to name. He barely looked up as I pulled out a chair across from him. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, the top buttons of his shirt undone, exposing the sharp lines of his collarbone. He looked relaxed, at ease, but there was something else, something just beneath the surface, lurking behind his gaze. "You never struck me as a whiskey type," I said lightly, trying to sound casual, as if my stomach wasn't twisting just from being in the same room as him. His lips quirked. "And you never struck me as the type to notice." I shrugged, leaning back against the chair, crossing my legs. "I notice more than you think." His gaze lifted then, sharp, assessing. He studied me for a moment, then took another sip of his drink. "Never thought stepfathers could be this cool," I teased, testing the waters, waiting to see how he would react. Ryden smirked, setting his glass down. He studied me, fingers tapping lightly against the counter. "And you never thought that things could be different?" His voice was smooth, deliberate. Something inside me jolted. My breath hitched, but I masked it, forcing a small laugh. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head slightly, watching me the way a predator watches something small and uncertain. Then, after a pause, he exhaled and shook his head. "Forget it," he said. "Just thinking about how people like to test their limits sometimes." Limits. The word felt heavier than it should have. My stomach flipped, but I kept my expression neutral. "You think testing limits is a good thing?" Ryden chuckled. "Depends on the limit." The ice in his glass clinked again as he took another sip, and I swallowed, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing between us. I should have left the kitchen. I should have walked away. But I didn't, because the truth was, I wanted to see what would happen if I stayed. The silence stretched, thick and charged. Ryden leaned back in his chair, still watching me, his expression unreadable. "You act so sure of yourself," he murmured, his voice almost thoughtful. "But I think you like being tested." A shiver ran through me, sharp and unexpected. My pulse quickened. "You don't know anything about me." His smirk deepened. "Maybe not. Or maybe I see more than you think." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to hold his gaze, even though I felt like I was drowning in it. This was a game. A dangerous one. And I had no idea who was winning. "Go ahead," he said, lifting his glass. "Tell me I'm wrong." I wanted to. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would put distance between us, something that would remind both of us where the line was. But my throat had gone dry. Because the truth, the awful, undeniable truth, was that he wasn't wrong. I liked it. I liked this game. I liked the way his words made my stomach twist, the way his gaze made my skin prickle, the way I felt completely out of my depth and yet somehow unwilling to stop. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. But I stayed in my chair anyway, heartbeat hammering, fingers curled around the edge of the counter. Ryden took another sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving mine. That's what I thought. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to break eye contact, to look anywhere but at him. The clock on the wall, the empty glass in front of me, the way my hands trembled slightly against my lap. I needed to get out of here. "I should go," I said, pushing back my chair. Ryden didn't stop me. He didn't reach for me, didn't block my path. He just leaned back, watching as I stood up, as if he already knew I wouldn't leave. And for a second, neither did I. I hesitated, heart pounding, waiting for him to say something, waiting for some kind of cue, some kind of signal that I wasn't the only one who felt this tension coiling between us. But he just smirked. "Good night, Avery." His voice sent a shiver down my spine. I turned and walked away, but my hands were still shaking, because I knew this wasn't over. Months had passed. At first, it was just a game, fleeting glances, subtle touches, moments we pretended not to notice. But now, it had turned into something more, something dangerous. Every conversation, every movement felt like a part of an invisible thread tightening between us, pulling us closer to a place we both knew we shouldn't go. I told myself I was imagining it, that I had control over this, that nothing was happening unless I allowed it to. But the truth was, the moment I realized I was thinking that way, I had already lost control. The tension between us had grown unbearable, but neither of us acknowledged it out loud. We never addressed the moments that hung between us long after they had passed, the way my breath caught when he walked too close, the way his eyes darkened whenever I held his gaze for a second too long, the way his fingertips lingered just slightly longer than necessary when handing me something. It was an unspoken game, one that I thought I could walk away from whenever I wanted. But I was lying to myself. That night in the mountain cabin, everything changed. My mother had gone to bed early, exhausted from the long drive, leaving just the two of us on the veranda. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, not so much from the cold but to ground myself, to create even the illusion of a barrier between us. The wind rustled the trees, a sound that should have felt peaceful but only made the silence between us feel heavier. Ryden leaned against the wooden railing, the dim glow from the cabin illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He looked relaxed, his drink in hand, but I knew him well enough by now to know that wasn't entirely true. There was something beneath the surface, something simmering just out of sight. His voice broke the silence. "Why do you get so tense when we're alone?" I gripped the blanket tighter, my nails pressing into the fabric. "I don't." His gaze flickered to mine, a knowing smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Liar." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to hold his stare even though my pulse was hammering. "I just think it's better if we—" His smirk deepened. "If we what?" I swallowed hard. "If we keep things normal." He chuckled softly, taking a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down on the railing. "Define normal." I hesitated. The way he said it, the way his voice dipped just slightly, made my stomach twist. "We shouldn't be having this conversation," I muttered. "But we are," he countered easily, his tone unreadable. "And you're still sitting here." I didn't have a response to that, because he was right. He turned to face me fully, his arms crossed. "Tell me you haven't thought about it." My throat went dry. "Thought about what?" He arched a brow. "You know exactly what." My fingers tightened around the blanket. This was going too far. I needed to stop this before. He took a step closer. Not enough to touch me, but enough that I felt the warmth of his body against the cold night air. My breath hitched involuntarily. "But you don't want me to stop, do you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it may as well have been a scream. I was frozen in place. This was the moment, the line, the second before something irreversible happened. His fingers brushed against my wrist, featherlight, trailing up my arm in a way that made my skin burn. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then, his lips ghosted over my skin, a whisper of a touch. And that's when it happened. The phone rang. The sharp sound shattered everything. We both jerked away from each other like we had been caught doing something forbidden. Ryden exhaled sharply and, without looking at me, pulled his phone from his pocket. "Yeah, babe?" My stomach dropped. I went numb. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure what I had expected him to say, but those words hit me like a slap. His entire demeanor shifted instantly. His shoulders tensed, his jaw locked. His fingers clenched around the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "What? Are you serious?" I stared at him, at the way his expression darkened. His grip on the phone tightened further. "You're pregnant?" The words crashed into me like a tidal wave. Everything blurred. The night, the cold air, the warmth of his touch only moments ago, none of it made sense anymore. I felt sick. I barely registered him continuing the conversation, nodding, murmuring things into the phone, but the words didn't reach me. I wasn't even sure I was breathing. We had been seconds away from something irreversible. And now, it all felt disgusting. I stood up on unsteady legs, my body moving on autopilot. "I need to go," I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. Ryden didn't stop me. He didn't say a word. I turned and walked inside, my mind a chaotic storm of thoughts I couldn't untangle. I climbed the stairs, entered my room, closed the door. Then, finally, I let out the breath I had been holding. I pressed my hands to my face, my fingers trembling. What were we doing? What was I doing? This wasn't just a game anymore. This was real, and I needed to stop before it was too late. The morning light felt different. It wasn't warm or welcoming. It was harsh, sharp, cutting through the curtains like a blade, exposing everything I didn't want to face. My chest was tight. My limbs felt heavy. But there was one thought ringing in my head, clear and undeniable. This has to end. I couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't lie to myself. Couldn't keep playing with fire, knowing how close I had come to being consumed by it. I had let myself get pulled in, had let my thoughts spiral into something that was never supposed to happen. And now, there was no more room for illusions. I forced myself out of bed, each movement heavier than the last. My reflection in the mirror looked foreign, eyes too wide, lips pressed into a tight line. I looked like a person who had barely slept, a person unraveling under the weight of something unspeakable. But I had made my decision. I moved through the house as if I wasn't really there, my mind already downstairs before my body caught up. My fingers traced the cold railing as I descended the steps, my breathing shallow, my pulse erratic. When I finally reached the kitchen, he was there. Ryden sat at the table, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, his posture relaxed. Too relaxed, as if nothing had changed, as if last night had been a fleeting moment, insignificant, forgettable. But I knew better, and so did he. His gaze flickered up when he heard my footsteps, meeting mine with an expression I couldn't read. I expected awkwardness. I expected hesitation, but all I saw was a quiet, waiting stillness. I exhaled sharply, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down. The silence between us was suffocating. Then, finally, I said it. This will never happen again. My voice was flat, but there was steel beneath it. I needed him to hear it, to understand, to accept it as fact. He didn't speak right away. His grip on the cup tightened, the muscles in his jaw shifting almost imperceptibly. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. Yes, that was it. A single word. No argument. No protest. It should have felt like relief washing over me. It should have felt like closure. But it didn't. Because I wasn't done. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling into fists against my lap. My voice came out quieter this time, barely above a whisper. My mom is carrying your child. The words hung in the air between us like a bomb that had just been set off in slow motion. Ryden's eyes darkened slightly, his jaw clenching. He set his cup down with careful precision, as if suddenly aware of the weight of his own movements. I know. A bitter laugh bubbled in my throat. Do you? His gaze snapped back to mine, something sharp flashing in his expression. What do you want me to say, Avery? I held his stare, my heart pounding. I want you to acknowledge what almost happened. His expression barely shifted, but I saw it, the flicker of something behind his eyes. Guilt? Regret? Something else? He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. You think I don't know how close we got? His voice was low, strained. You think I haven't been thinking about it? My stomach twisted, and I hated that his words affected me. That the honesty in his tone made my pulse quicken instead of calming me down. I don't care what you're thinking, I lied. It doesn't matter anymore. Ryden let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping once against the surface of the table before stilling. You're right, but I wasn't sure he believed that. Neither did I. The weight of everything settled over us, a suffocating presence in the room. The months of stolen glances, unspoken words, invisible lines that we had kept redrawing until there was nothing left to separate us. It had all led to this moment, this breaking point, this fork in the road where we had no choice but to walk away. And yet, neither of us moved. I forced myself to break the silence. I'm leaving for college in a few months. His lips pressed into a tight line. That's good. I nodded slowly, as if confirming it for myself. Yeah. Another silence. This one felt different. Not tense. Not suffocating. Just final. I stood up, pushing my chair back without looking at him. My hands trembled slightly at my sides, but I ignored it. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to, because there was nothing left to say. As I walked away, I felt his gaze on me, but I didn't turn back. Because this was the ending. A story no one would ever know. A mistake that never fully happened. And maybe that was the only victory we had left. Because sometimes, the real victory isn't in what you do. It's in what you don't.